speaker, Dr. Mandy Paterson. Mandy's discussion this afternoon is dispelling the myth that mandatory desexing doesn't help with cat overpopulation. Mandy's background: she's held the position of Principal Scientist of the RSPCA Queensland for 5 years. She has a very keen interest in animal welfare generally, policy development, exhibit animals, shelter animal management, wildlife, and many other areas within the RSPCA. She represents the RSPCA on government committees, including areas of kangaroo management, injured koala care, Fraser Island dingoes, to name but a few. Mandy is also involved in research in collaboration with the University of Queensland and teaches veterinary science students. Mandy serves on the board of ANZCART and is the chair of the Centre for Animal Welfare and Ethics Advisory Committee. Please welcome Dr. Mandy Paterson.
Got to get into it first. Yes, please. Where do you press? I was up there, but where do you press to shut that down?
Let's make that go away and go back. And that should be you. And there you are.
And down here.
Slideshow.
Oh, we can do it down here.
Yeah, it'll run you in there. You've got display and slide presenter and touch. How many slides you have left in your time?
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, well, I'm going to be talking about cats, and as the title says, dispelling the myth that mandatory desexing won't help with the cat overpopulation problem. And I know one of the other speakers yesterday talked about office foster, so some of the pictures today in this presentation are actually cats that I've fostered in my office, including that one that was later adopted by a friend of mine. Now, we all know about companion animals and how popular they are, and more popular these days are terms like fur babies and fur kids. These are some statistics from 2009, but 63% of households in Australia own a companion animal. Only 23% own a cat. But of those people who don't currently own a cat, 53% said that they wanted to. And there are people who want to own cats or a companion animal, and they don't because of their living arrangements. I don't know what it's like in the US, but we all know that in Queensland anyway, a lot of tenant situations where you rent property, you're not allowed to have an animal. Over 90% of the people interviewed reported being extremely close to their pet, and we all understand that, being all animal lovers, that having a pet is actually beneficial to people's health. It's actually good for physical and mental well-being. And here's just some of the lists that different research has shown is the benefits of companion animals, and we understand this. I put this here just to remind us about the benefits of having a pet, and this includes having a cat. All right, now we're going to move on to what this talk is really about, and it's about overpopulation. What justifies the use of this term? Why do we talk about the cat overpopulation problem? Now, we heard Diana before giving us some fairly frightening statistics about the population of cats, and she went through all the various states. And I guess one of the major things that I got out of listening to that was how much worse it is if you're a cat than if you're a dog. I think even with the statistics she showed, it was over 50% euthanasia rate for cats. And I think that when I was thinking about, we use this, we get used to using this term, but what justifies its use? Really, that there's more cats and kittens available than homes. It doesn't matter. We have, and I'm going to show you some stats in a minute that show that we've been reasonably successful at increasing our adoption rate for cats. But the truth is that there are cats being born that are destined to die because there's just not enough homes. And also in Australia, there's evidence that there's a growing feral cat population. However, and that's defining feral as cats that live out away from humans, not interacting with humans, that are living. This is not a behavioral definition. It means really they're wild cats. But why is it a problem? I mean, all right, maybe you could say, well, I've established that there's an overpopulation, but why is that a problem? Why does it matter that we have a lot of cats? Well, healthy cats and kittens are having to be euthanized, as Diana showed us, and any stats we look at will show us that. And for most people, the fact that healthy cats are being euthanized is a problem. Then, apart from that, stray and unowned cats cause problems. They kill wildlife. They fight with other cats. They cause nuisance when they're on season and they're calling, they're mating, whatever. They cause a nuisance. They also are a source of zoonotic diseases. And in a way, because cats are so readily available, and because we euthanize so many, I would argue, therefore, they're not valued, that they're sort of like a throwaway. I mean, I'm sure all of you in this room have bad stories that you can tell, but I have met people who have, at the beginning of the school holidays, got a kitten, right? They've got a kitten, and they'll say, oh, well, it's good for the kids to play with during the school holidays. And when the kids go back to school 6 weeks later, they hand the cat into a shelter or a pound. They don't need it anymore. And this is like a throwaway kitten. And I think that is a problem, and it's not ethically right for our society to think that that's okay for it to happen. Also, just to add to some of Diana's figures that she presented, from some research that has been conducted with RSPCA Queensland, from July 2006 to June 2008, there was 33,000 cats, that's in the 2-year period, 33,000 cats were admitted to RSPCA Queensland. And this is a few years ago. Remember, this ended in 2008, and things have improved, and I will talk about that. But 65% of those cats were euthanized. Now, some of those were due to old age, or they were feral in the behavioral sense, and some of them had diseases, but some of them were perfectly healthy. So that is why the overpopulation is a problem. And this is not dissimilar. Around the same time, some US stats were reporting 71% euthanasia rate. Okay. And the other reason that I wanted to talk about is that cats are prolific breeders. Cats, as we heard yesterday, or was it today, I can't remember, that cats can start breeding as early as 4 months of age. Research, I mean, we all know cats can have 2 or more litters, but on average, research suggests that they have 1.4 litters a year, and that 3 kittens per litter survive. That is a lot of cats being born. And I think that another thing to realize with cats, and some people are not aware of this, that their breeding cycle is quite different than dogs. Dogs, come on season twice a year in most cases. You can lock them up for 3 weeks, and if you do a good job of locking them up, they're not going to get pregnant. But cats are not like that. They only go off season if they mate. They only ovulate, which means they only ovulate if they mate, and they have to ovulate to go off season. So cats will stay on season for quite a long time. They may appear to go off season for a day or two, but they generally will stay on season until they mate. And if you've ever had a queen on season, you will know how difficult it is to keep that cat confined and how noisy it is. It's not an easy thing. A lot of people do not realize how good cats are at getting pregnant. Now, this slide is just some statistics that I took from RSPCA Queensland website. So these figures are actually available on our website. And there's this year, which is, the figures are not up there yet, but they're just about to go up there, and the last 2 years. And it shows that In the light blue is the number of cats that have come in, or cats or kittens, and in the dark blue is the number that were euthanized. And you can see that the number coming in has, well, with cats, has stayed fairly steady over the last 3 years. Kittens have dropped a bit, but then the last 2 years have been fairly steady. The euthanasia rate, you can see, I said that we've done a lot better job recently. The figure that I said before, which was from work done by PhD student Corinne Albertson. Actually, I'll pronounce her name correctly in a minute when I've got it in front of me. But what was I saying? Yeah, forgotten my train of thought. But anyway, her results, that one I quoted before, was for 2 years before June 2008. So these figures are after that. So we have instigated a whole lot of different strategies to try and increase our adoption rate and decrease our euthanasia rate. So you can see that we have been successful with some of those things. So that is fantastic. But what we want to see is a reduction in the number actually coming in, not just the number that we're, we don't want to just see a reduction in the euthanasia rate, which is good. We want to see that. We want to see a reduced number actually coming into the shelter. And because this is just our shelter, it doesn't actually count all the other shelters in pounds. All right, so now what does the RSPCA advocate? Well, RSPCA advocates mandatory desexing of cats before sexual maturity. That is, on or before this 4 months of age. And to make this easier, we say desexing, mandatory desexing before sale or transfer, and therefore you'll get them before they're going to their new home. We do say, well, obviously some people are going to breed cats and they're going to breed them responsibly, therefore they're going to be able to be some sort of system where a breeder could become a licensed breeder. But generally, for most companion cats, they're going to be desexed. We support mandatory identification, so that's microchipping, that means, and the microchipping being kept up to date. Of course, this will not work unless there's an increased awareness of what it means to be a responsible pet owner. And that includes things like understanding your responsibility to have your animal desexed, responsibilities around vaccination, around confinement of the cat, things like that, what it means to be a responsible pet owner. Also, we understand that there has to be accessible and affordable desexing available, and we've heard a lot about that yesterday. And of course, nothing is going to work unless there's some level of enforcement. So there has to be awareness, the rules have to be easily understood, but there also has to be enforcement. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, so now we get to the actual, the main part of what I want to talk about. Whenever mandatory desexing is talked about, there are a whole lot of reasons put forward about why it won't work. And these are the ones that I want to talk about. First reason that's given is that there's already a high level of desexing amongst owned cats, and therefore really by making desexing mandatory, all we're doing is targeting people who are already doing the right thing. There's a risk of loss of genetic diversity if all the cats were desexed. There's a risk of reduced availability of cats. These are all, I've read all of these in the literature. It hasn't worked in the past is one of the major arguments that are used, and such a policy is not supported by stakeholders. So what I want to do now is just examine each of those arguments and present arguments against those arguments. So let's first of all look at the high level of desexing already. There's a very well quoted figure that 90% of cats are desexed already. Now, that may be true. We would have to maybe question where that figure comes from, but there has been some research that shows that figure. However, getting back to Corinne's work, over that same 2-year period that I mentioned before, when just over 33,000 cats and kittens came into the RSPCA all over Queensland, 46% of them were adults and 54% were less than 3 months of age. That's just to give you a background. But anyway, what Corinne did was, from our data, she actually took out the adults that that were surrendered by owners. So people who came in and said they owned the particular cat but were surrendering it. We're not going to look at the reasons, but they were what we call owner-surrendered cats, and only 34% of those animals were desexed prior to coming into our shelter, which is, of course, a lot less than the 90% that's being quoted. Just to say a little bit more about the figures that she got, 13% of all cats in shelters are desexed. So that was counting all kittens and stray cats. So probably that figure is not such a useful figure, although I've got it there because it's very similar to figures that are quoted elsewhere. But so one argument is that from her figures, only 34% of adult owner-surrendered cats were desexed prior to surrender. The other figure that I think is very interesting is that 54% of the cats surrendered were kittens. That is, they were under 3 months of age. Now, if you think about that for a minute, 50% of those came from owned cats. So people brought these kittens in and said they were from their cats, from owned cats. So if 50% of the 54% were from owned cats, it means those owned cats were not desexed. So it starts making you wonder a little bit about the 90%. But anyway, let's continue. To continue to look at that argument, I think we have to question saying 90% are desexed is not telling us anything about when that cat was desexed, or whether that cat had some litters before it was desexed. So yeah, it's great that 90% are desexed, but what we want them to be desexed before they have any litters at all. I said that 50% of the 54% that came from owned cats, perhaps those people went and had them desexed then, but really we want them to have them desexed before they have any. Some other research has shown that 20% of owned cats in Australia have at least one litter before they're desexed, and so that 20% is at least a group of cats that we want to get them desexed before they have the litter. And in a US study, they report 45% of female cats were 12 months old when they were desexed. And if you think about that, they would have probably had at least one litter by that stage. And actually, that study goes on to claim, and this is a little bit of an odd claim, but they make it in this paper, that the number of kittens born to ultimately sterilized cats equals the number born to cats never sterilized. If you think about that, it's a bit hard to believe, but that is what that paper actually claims, and used some mathematical models to come to that conclusion. So I guess through those two slides, what I'm trying to do is saying that the argument, oh well, most cats are desexed, that owned cats are desexed, we're only by mandatory desexing is targeting people who are doing the right thing anyway, I think is not a valid argument. We want people to have their cats desexed before they have any kittens whatsoever. So the second argument is loss of genetic diversity. In fact, there's no evidence for this argument whatsoever. Breeders who are licensed would continue to breed cats, and according to our policy, they would not necessarily have to be breeding purebred cats. They could also be breeding domestic short-haired cats. And also there's a lot of evidence in the literature that cats move readily between the owned and unowned populations. People leave cats behind when they move. Cats stray from a home because perhaps you get a new dog or something. So there's a lot of evidence that cats move, and therefore if that continues to happen, of course you're getting genetic diversity. So along the drop in genetic diversity and the drop in availability arguments often go together, and there's no evidence that there's going to be a drop of availability. But perhaps if there was, it would be a good thing. Maybe we would value cats a bit more if they weren't so readily available. I mean, you can pick up a free cat anywhere right now. So let's make cats a little valued more by making them a little bit less available. there was a study in Australia that showed that the decline in cat ownership that currently exists in Australia is nothing to do with a drop in cat availability, but is actually due to lifestyle choices and where people are living. And also, actually what came out of that was something to do with cat behaviours. Some people don't like some of the things that cats do. And I think that the drop in availability is a ridiculous argument when we look at the sort of statistics that Diana gave us and the statistics I've already presented. There's such an oversupply of cats and kittens right now, and we're euthanizing cats and kittens. So I think let's start worrying about drop in availability when we've got that problem under control. Right, it hasn't worked in the past is probably the second most favourite argument that people put to why we shouldn't bring this in. So really, before you can start looking at that, you've really got to look, why hasn't it worked? And, you know, there's been papers written about this. One of the reasons is that it hasn't been, they perhaps brought it in but didn't also bring any sort of enforcement in, or they didn't resource it adequately, or there wasn't good education or awareness around around the change in the legislation. One of the things, people often talk about the ACT when they talk about it not working, and they quote the ACT as saying, well, it didn't work in the ACT, they brought it in quite a while ago. But just getting back to Corinne's research that she's going to publish very soon, hasn't come out yet, but actually it shows that, let me just get this right, that the ACT has the highest percentage of cats that are desexed that come into their shelter in Australia. Now, I talked about the 34% in Queensland. That was quite a few years. In fact, I think our figures for Corinne's work using a much larger 4 or 5 year lot of figures actually came up to something like 54% of cats coming into, cats that were owned coming into Queensland shelters were desexed. But in the ACT, it's up to 81%. So 81% of owned cats being surrendered to the ACT are desexed, which would suggest that the amount of desexing is working, depending on what assessment criteria you want to use. But if you're using number of cats that are actually desexed as whether it works or not, that is some indication that it's working. But just to finish that story, one of the things about the ACT legislation is that their mandatory desexing is, they have 6 months as the age that they have to be desexed by. And I would argue that that's too old. And in fact, they've got the lowest rate of desexing the kittens. Oh, has it? Right. Well, but when... Yeah, well, that's what I was, thank you. What I was saying that, well, I'll just continue from Corinne's figures, which of course are not, they were up to about a year ago. There was only 5% of kittens were desexed, which is a really low number. But the argument would be that it was because they had to be 6 months. But Michael's just told us that they've changed that, which is brilliant, and hopefully that will start making a difference in there. But I think it's interesting that people keep saying it doesn't work. Look at ACT, but there's evidence that it is working in the ACT. All right. I think we have to ask what measures were being used to assess it, and we've come up with a couple of measures. Might be the number of animals that are surrendered, the number of animals surrendered that are desexed, etc., etc. There's probably other measures as well. What would, I think we also have to ask, what would help make it work? And I've just got a couple of things written down there. Education and communication. If people aren't aware of the change, if there's no enforcement, it's not going to work. I mean, why would it work if nobody's really knowing about it and no one's actually making sure it happens? And you have to have the identification. You have to be able to identify the animal, else you can't enforce it either. So you've really got to put some resources into it. You've got to include identification. So it has to come with a package of other things. Okay. The next argument used is that it's not supported by stakeholders. And I think we have to ask ourselves then, who are these various stakeholders who are not supporting it? Veterinarians are said not to support it, and the AVA, the Australian Veterinary Association, are said not to support it. Now, one could examine that, and the AVA actually on their website say they don't support it because they don't think there's enough research being done into it. Now, that is probably true. There isn't enough research. But I would argue, and I'm a vet, so I can actually criticize vets, I think that even though there's not enough research, and I would agree with that, I think we have enough that we can act. That if we keep waiting for more research, we will be euthanizing more and more cats in the interim, and we don't want to do that. I guess I think a little bit about why do vets say they're against it? Are they worried about their business? Are they thinking there won't be enough cats for them to desex? I don't know. The pet industry say that they don't support it, and again, one might wonder about their reasons for not supporting it. And an interesting thing, the no-kill shelter movement from the US do not support it. And if you read their argument, I find it very interesting. They don't support it because where they have actually brought it in the States, there's been an increased number of cats brought to the shelter. So initially, you see an increase in the number of cats brought to the shelter, and they say, well, therefore it's harder for them to maintain a no-kill. Now, they say that it's because people can't afford to have it desexed, so therefore, you know, by bringing it in, we're discriminating against people who can't afford to have their cat desexed. I guess I would argue that it would be better for these animals to come into the shelter and maybe be rehomed than breeding and not coming in. Because if they can't afford to have it desexed, that animal is breeding, and there will be more kittens and cats in the future that cause the overpopulation problem. So this reasoning to me is not very satisfactory. And also, it is sort of assumes that people are making that very specific choice. I cannot afford to have my cat desexed, therefore I'm not doing it. But I'm a really responsible owner every other way. I'm not going to allow it to have kittens and et cetera, et cetera. And it completely ignores that other research has shown that people don't have their cats desexed for a whole lot of reasons, including, I just didn't get around to it, or oh, I didn't realize it would get pregnant so young, that sort of argument, rather than, you know, this very specific choice. So I don't buy into their arguments at all. But actually, some stakeholders do support mandatory desexing, and many animal management officers actually support it, because they do believe that it will reduce the number of cats causing problems in their area that they're responsible for. A lot of animal welfare organizations support it because, unfortunately, we're the people who see all these gorgeous animals that we try and find homes. And you'll see that I have had photos on all my slides, and that I hope have just shown how gorgeous and adorable cats are. And these are ones that are most of these, although there's a couple that were actually, I didn't point out another one that was my office foster cat. The others are all cats that have been through our shelter, and these are the photos that are taken by our volunteer photographer. Then these are the photos that go up on our Adopt a Pet website. So these are actual cats that have come through our shelter. In the US, PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, support this particular mandatory desexing as an idea. And I didn't mention before that there are quite a few shires in the US that have mandatory desexing. And although I couldn't find a lot of research about the results from those shires, some of the very preliminary findings that I could access seem to suggest that they are working by some parameters. And finally, I would argue that the public actually support this mandatory desexing. In 2009, RSPCA Queensland conducted some research where we looked at a number of issues, but one of them was mandatory desexing. We got just over 1,000 responses to this survey, and 87% of responses supported mandatory desexing, and only 2% of the people strongly opposed it. And the reasons that they gave were concern for wildlife, 96%, because if you've got cats, you know they will hunt. And even when they're desexed, though, they hunt. The idea here, it's all really, in a way, that maybe isn't quite right, because they'll still hunt if they're desexed, but maybe if along with the mandatory desexing there was a whole lot of education about keeping your cat confined, perhaps those two would go together. But I'm just telling you the results of the survey. 96% were concerned about wildlife. There was 86% that were concerned about the number of cats killed in shelters and other places, but 96% actually said they were concerned about irresponsible cat owners, and I won't go into any more details about that. Right, so in conclusion, although the RSPCA has this policy, we do understand the implementation of such a policy is complex, and it has to be well planned to include education and resource compliance. Desexing must be readily available and affordable so people can have their animals desexed. And if it's going to be before sale or transfer, we do need to have more and more vets willing to do juvenile desexing, and we had talks about that yesterday. And of course the RSPCA supports juvenile desexing, and I know that a lot of vets, and I mean I'm a vet, and when I went through vet science we did not learn how to do juvenile desexing, and since I don't work as a vet anymore, I've actually never done juvenile desexing, but I've talked to enough people at the RSPCA who do it on a regular basis, and as the people talked about it yesterday, it's great. And particularly for cats, there is absolutely no evidence of problems if cats are desexed at a young age. Dogs, we can leave alone. Here I'm talking about cats. But so to be having desexing readily available and affordable, we need to have a lot of vets who are going to be willing to do it at a young age. And we need enforceable and enforced laws that send a strong message about responsible pet ownership. Thanks.